Hello, my name is Pat McIntosh, and I want to thank you for joining us here on Written for Our Learning. This is a program that is dedicated to looking at the numerous areas of revelation that we have for us in the Old Testament, prophecies, types and antitypes, historical narrative, and looking at the lessons that we can glean from those. Of course, the primary passage under our consideration is Romans chapter 15, verse 4. And there we're seeing the value of the Old Testament, the things written aforetime or written for our learning. One of my favorite studies through the Old Testament is that of God's plan to save man, the scheme of redemption. And we want to look at a thumbnail sketch of that in our few minutes together here in this episode of our study. I want to deal with the topic, solving the sin problem. Well, what kind of problem are we discussing? Well, let's take a quick look there at the early portion of the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 1, we see that God created the heavens and the earth. And we see those details provided there throughout that chapter of God's creative work. And then in chapter 2, we see what some mistakenly have referred to as a second creation account. As a matter of fact, it's really an amplification of just one aspect of what we saw in Genesis chapter 1. There we see the creation of man, and we see more about God's establishment and dealing with man. We see the garden providing for man's needs. We see the limitation being placed on the fact that they could eat anything of the garden, but they could not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or they would surely die. There in Genesis chapter 3, specifically verses 1 through 13, we see the fall of man. We see that Eve was enticed by the serpent. The fruit fit all three areas of temptation that we find today: the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. She ate the fruit, being deceived to do so, and then she went and took the fruit to Adam, and he ate, though not deceived, according to the text. That introduced the sin problem. Man fell into sin on that occasion. Likewise, looking there at Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, there we see God dealing with that sin problem. In other words, God establishing a plan through which man could be brought back into fellowship and brought back into a relationship with him. And we see there in Genesis 3:15, the first messianic prophecy, that it was going to be through the seed of woman that God was going to bring about this redemption, this salvation. You know, we often talk about our Bibles being divided between Malachi and Matthew. We've got that page, those clear blank pages that are in there, and that's okay. I understand that. But when we look at the practical nature of it, especially as it refers to God's plan to save man, it's my belief, as well as others, where the Frank Chester portrayed this in his book, Portrait of God, an excellent reference on the scheme of redemption, that it's really Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 that needs to be that delineating mark in our Bibles. Because beginning there in that verse and then moving throughout the remainder of Scripture, we see God working on man's redemption and the ultimate spiritual promise that God made regarding having a home with him in the end. Well, that seed prophecy took on a couple of different forms as we move on through. For example, in Genesis chapter 12, chapter 15, and chapter 22, we see the promise being made to Abraham about this promise. We see Abraham, we see Isaac, we see Jacob all being involved in that promise and as it moves through. And each of them were given the same basic promise that through their seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Well, then we see a little bit more provided for us in a promise made regarding Judah in Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10. There we're told that the scepter would not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. We see a king being referenced there in conjunction with this seed promise. That word Shiloh, of course, is thought to be defined as the one to whom it belongs. The scepter shall not depart from Judah until the one to whom it belongs comes. When we look at 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 14, in essence, we see this promise reiterated through David. David is the second of the kings of the United Kingdom. And it's going to be through his seed that this king is going to come. So we see David's line, we see Judah, we see Abraham, we see all of these prophecies running concurrently throughout the Old Testament, headed toward a New Testament application of those promises. Now, the question that comes to mind is, who or what is that seed? The last promise of Malachi, that Messiah is coming, and one like Elijah is going to prepare the way for him, basically preceded Christ by about 400 years, 400 to 500 years. Messiah, the anointed one, the king, is here. But I want us to focus in quickly here on Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, as it relates to the fulfillment of this promise. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. When the fullness of the time had come, some translations indicate that meaning when the time was right. According to God's plan, according to God's timetable, the seed has arrived. The Jews had misunderstood that. Elsewhere here in the book of Galatians, Paul refers to the seed promise as being one seed, not seeds as of many. You see, they had twisted that to simply tie themselves to the seed promise as descendants of Abraham. But the tie that we have, the inroads, the path that we have to God is through this seed. Acts chapter 4, verse 12, so there's no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. May we be thankful for the seed promise. May we be thankful for the instruction that's provided for us to more fully understand that as we open up our New Testaments. Until next time, God bless you.